Salt marshes occur between sea margins and the land, often at the heads of sea lochs and estuaries. Hello, I'm Helen Bibby, Conservation Consultant for SAC Consulting. In this video, I'm going to explain why salt marshes are important for agriculture and conservation, and how to manage them. By definition, salt marshes are coastal wetlands, where flooding depends on the tides. The vegetation is composed of salt-tolerant plants such as specialised grasses and herbs. The soil is deep mud and peat, created over many years. Salt marshes are high value in many respects. One of the most obvious to me is as a habitat for waders and other wildlife, particularly geese, along with their food source. Earlier in the year we spoke to Louise Muir from the RSPB on the value of salt marshes and the best way to manage them.
We're here on Islay. We've been looking at salt marshes today. I have with me today Louise Muir from the RSPB, who's going to keep us right with some of the salt marshes that we've been looking at today. So when it comes to salt marshes, I'm quite aware that biodiversity and farming is quite a crucial part of salt marshes. So Louise, can you tell us a bit about the biodiversity of the salt marsh and why it's valuable?
So the salt marshes on Islay, salt marshes in general are quite dynamic habitats, and that in itself creates this huge diversity. And they respond to different things, and in particular quite sensitive to things like pollution and development, but also grazing can really have a strong influence on their diversity. So the impact of farm animals and the timings and the densities of grazing from cattle and sheep can affect the diversity on salt marshes.
So what would you say is kind of an ideal grazing pattern for salt marshes?
So I think they need different types of grazing. So they need a bit of cattle, a bit of sheep, and the species that on them have got different habitat requirements. So for example, if we have redshank nesting on the salt marshes, then they require quite a sort of not a very short sward, but medium sward. So they like to hide, they like to have their nest in there. So they need that kind of height, whereas lapwing prefer sort of more grazing. They would have access to open soil as well. So there's a range of different, I guess, habitats and lengths you would have. But ideally, the densities would need to be very light during the nesting period. So you would reduce trampling. And you would also, I guess, light grazing in summer would increase botanical diversity, so flowering and seeding of those plants.
And have you got any figures for roughly what you think, what density of livestock should be? Because we often use like below 1 livestock unit per hectare or something.
So it would be low livestock density, and I guess it really depends on also the type of cattle and sheep you've got there as well. So a lighter breed of sheep, a breed of cattle, but definitely under 1 livestock per unit per hectare would be ideal, and I would say lower than that. So yeah.
And so you're talking about mostly salt marshes for nesting birds. Is that the most common thing that, is that why salt marshes are so important?
No, so as well as nesting birds, they're really important for wintering birds. So particularly on Islay, we have really large flocks of Greenland white-fronted geese and Greenland barnacle geese here over winter. So disturbance is really a key issue on the salt marsh as well. So trying to keep disturbance when they're feeding there, and particularly when they're roosting. So there's some really important roosts on the salt marshes on Islay here.
And so what value does farming on the salt marshes give that? Because I'm assuming that livestock are actually really part of the system for salt marshes, and that a lot of these birds wouldn't be there without grazing.
Yeah, so exactly that. So without grazing, you wouldn't be able to create these different lengths of vegetation, and they're the best tool for the job. So if you can do it with cattle and sheep, then it's a win-win really. So you get those different elements of heights of the vegetation, less grazing, particularly in nesting periods. A disturbance should be relatively low, but if they're quite extensively grazed, then that normally isn't an issue. But yeah, farming is really integral to salt marsh management here on Islay.
Louise has briefly explained why salt marshes are important and best management for wildlife. But that is not their only value. These specialised habitats act as a buffer between the sea and the land, reducing erosion. They are also important global carbon sinks, storing carbon at a significantly higher rate than forests per unit area. The carbon is captured by the plants and stored in the sediments, which extend several metres deep, where it can be locked in for centuries. The most common use of salt marshes is within the agricultural industry, where it is a valuable grazing resource. Next, we speak to Craig Archibald of Craigan's Farm in Islay, who explains the value of salt marsh grazing to his business, and also the way agriculture and biodiversity can work hand in hand for mutual benefit.
Hi Craig, it's really nice to see you on this really nice bit of saltings today. We're at Greenert Saltings on Islay, and I've got Craig Archibald here from Craigan's Farm, and he manages this bit of ground. So Craig, can you tell me something about how you manage this lovely bit of saltings?
This saltings really manages itself. In the spring, when the grass starts growing, usually the last couple of weeks of lambing, so beginning of May, the sheep will start coming down just as it starts to green up, and we've got to keep bringing them off till lambing's finished so we can see them lambing, and then after that it's just an addiction to them. They won't leave it, so the sheep, it's just getting roughly the right amount of sheep on the ground for the area that's there.
Okay, so the sheep are looking quite well in it just now. They're out all summer then, right to the winter?
Yeah, well they're on here all the way till last week in August, first week in September when we spain our lambs, and then they'll come off and we'll put them up the hill, and then that's it really for the winter. But at the same time as that happens, you've got geese arriving, so they're making the ground dirty, so the sheep don't really like it. Also, when you start getting higher tides in September, you get an awful lot more salt on it, and the sheep don't like that either. So.
Okay, so are the geese on it all winter then?
Yeah, the geese are on it all winter. So it starts with grey lags in the summer, which we could try and keep off, and then the barnacles come in October. Once they're in all winter, this is their roosts.
This is an actual roost site for them. Okay, that's great. That's kind of doing two things at once, because my understanding is that if you didn't have the sheep on it and you didn't have the grazing all summer, then the geese it would be too rough for the geese to come on it. So without the sheep, then you wouldn't have the geese, wouldn't come here at all.
Yeah, the geese in certain salt marsh and bits in Islay you see where it's not grazed down as much. The geese will only really use it when the weather's really bad, but here they'll use it for feeding and also a roost. They'll roost on the shore when the tide's out, and then they move back up onto here.
Excellent. So not only is this really good for your farming side, because what it's providing is quite clean ground for your sheep to come on at the start of the year, but it's providing a really good biodiversity service as well by keeping the ground good for geese. Do you want to kind of explain to me maybe what is the value, what you see as the value of having this kind of ground?
Well, to us it's a big part of our farm, because our hill is behind us here and the sheep are on there in the winter, and it's mainly heather, and you just wouldn't have the amount of feed for the lambs or for the stock without the salt marsh. The salt marsh is basically our summer grazing for probably 400 cows and their lambs.
Like many habitats, salt marshes are declining rapidly, the suggested loss being about 100 hectares per year. The main threats include erosion by vehicles and overgrazing, and erosion by the sea. Grazing reduces the vegetation height. Overgrazing can destroy the vegetation and cause the sediment to blow or wash away. This sediment takes a long time to repair. Undergrazing can also be an issue, as the structure becomes more tussocky, allowing rougher grasses to dominate. In summary, salt marshes are an extremely important and fragile habitat for many reasons. Best management depends on grazing levels, with light grazing the most effective, and if possible a summer grazing break to allow species to set seed and flower, and wildlife to be undisturbed, particularly during breeding. For more information, have a look at the FAS website, www.fas.scot.